Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar on the role of energy storage for accelerating the transition to a decarbonized clean energy future in Illinois. I am Megha Hamal. I am the Communications Manager for the Illinois Power Agency, and I will be your host today. Couple of housekeeping items before we start. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. Please feel free to submit any questions that you may have throughout the presentation in the chat window at the bottom of Zoom. Today's session is being recorded, and a copy of the recorded session and the presentation will be available on the IPA website under About IPA Events. Couple of points I would like to emphasize before we begin. The webinar is for general education purpose only and does not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the IPA or its staff. During the webinar, the speakers will provide an overview on the role of energy storage in decarbonization, highlight barriers and state-by-state activities and federal support for energy storage. The webinar will also examine what energy storage currently looks like in Illinois and the Illinois Commerce Commission's role in it. Again, those that are new to our Power Hour webinars, welcome. Power Hour is a series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. These are our two upcoming Power Hour webinars. Again, after the Power Hour 11, we will be wrapping up the Power Hour webinar series for this year, and we will begin the Power Hour webinar series again next year. So these are our Power Hour webinars for November and December. Please go ahead and register by just clicking the registration link. As the host of the Power Hour webinar series, I would like to give you a quick overview on the Illinois Power Agency. We are an independent state agency created in 2007. Our duties include developing and implementation procurement plans for electricity supply for utility customers. We're also in charge of developing and implementing solar incentive programs, and we're also responsible for implementing the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a public policy designed to increase the development of renewables here in Illinois. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Our speakers for this session are Anthony Starr, Senior Advisor, Interim Planning and Procurement Chief, IPA, Sarah Duffy, Deputy Legal Counsel, IPA, Todd Olinsky-Paul, Senior Project Director at Clean Energy States Alliance, CESA and Clean Energy Group. At CESA, Todd directs the Energy Storage and Technology Advancement Partnership Project, which aims to accelerate large-scale electrical energy storage deployment through collaborative efforts with state energy agencies. Todd also works on Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project in the areas of solar and storage for critical infrastructure, energy resiliency, distributed energy storage policy, and economics, and is the Clean Energy Group and CESA's lead for state energy policy support. Our last speaker for the session is Michael Surin, Policy Analyst at the Illinois Commerce Commission. In this role, Michael performs research and analysis of policy issues related to the regulation of public utilities, as well as all renewable energy procurement programs administered by the IPA. Prior to the ICC, Michael worked as a senior legislative analyst on the House Republican Research and Appropriations staff in the Illinois General Assembly, where he was responsible for staffing the House Public Utilities Committee and the House Energy Environment Committee. Welcome you all. So now I would like to go ahead and begin our webinar. Todd?
Yes. Okay, so you're going to advance the slides, right? Okay. Thanks very much. And I think you said 20 minutes, is that right?
That's right.
Okay, go ahead and advance the slide, please. Thanks for inviting me. Very happy to be here. As I was already introduced, I won't belabor my role and so forth, but I do want to give you a little bit of background information on what CESA is. If you could just go back one slide. CESA is Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a nonprofit located in Vermont. We work with state clean energy programs and agencies across the country. The Illinois Power Agency, of course, is a member. And CEG is a sister organization, also a nonprofit, and does very similar clean energy work, but with more foundation support. Next slide, please. So I was asked to start with a sort of overview of energy storage with some background before getting into state policy. So background on energy storage. We as a culture are very good at storing things, and generally we store anything that is vital. That includes liquid fuels, food. We have grain silos. We have warehouses full of all kinds of goods. We have water storage, pretty much everything except electricity. We're not very good at storing electricity. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of the amount of electricity that we actually store, this is on the left, a chart showing energy production in the United States, and on the right, showing the amount of installed storage. And what you should note about these two charts is that they're in different units. So we're looking at terawatt hours on the left and megawatt hours on the right. So what this amounts to is that we store a tiny, tiny fraction of the, well, I should say we are able to store a tiny fraction of the electricity that we can generate. Very, very tiny fraction. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Well, without storage, the electric grid is the world's biggest just-in-time delivery system. What I mean by that is that if you look at the traditional grid, we have generation, transmission, distribution, and consumption. Without storage, the generation has to ramp up and down following the demand for electricity. And generation and demand pretty much have to be equivalent to each other at any given moment. So when people come home after work and they start turning on the lights and the air conditioners and making dinner and so forth, demand for electricity goes up. The way we generally handle that is to increase generation to match demand. When people go to bed at night and turn off the lights, demand goes down. We then decrease generation. So essentially we're following the demand for electricity with the generation, and it all has to be equal in real time. So some of the other features of this sort of traditional grid are that power only flows in one direction generally. It flows from generation to consumers, not the other way. What that means is that there's no room in this, or not a lot of room, for a lot of behind the meter distributed generation, such as solar PV, for example. Now you can net meter PV back onto the grid, but that's limited. Without storage, what happens is that those two ends of the system, the generation and the consumption, will at some point get out of sync, because you have the consumers also acting as generators. That means that not only is demand going up and down in real time, but generation is going up and down in real time uncontrollably, because the sun shines when it shines and doesn't when it doesn't. Also, without storage, we have to overbuild this system to accommodate peak demand. And what I mean by that is that there's a few peak hours, usually in the summertime, and in this climate at least, when everybody's using air conditioning and the demand for electricity spikes. we have to have a system that's built to accommodate those peaks. And what that means is that most of the year, when we are not hitting those peaks of demand, we have a lot of idle capacity. We have generators that aren't generating. We have transmission and distribution lines that aren't at full capacity because we're simply overbuilding the system to meet occasional peaks. And the system is vulnerable to outages without energy storage because if a generator were to go down or a line were to go down, as happens very frequently in storms and due to wildfires and so forth, we then have a problem. Without storage, there's no way to ride through that outage until generation is brought back online or lines are repaired. Next slide, please. So storage is important, and almost any kind of system, you should have storage capacity. And we are just now getting to the point where we understand how to do this with our grid. So this is kind of a snapshot globally of what we have in the way of storage. Better than 90% of the storage around the world is pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is a very relatively old technology. It essentially means you pump water uphill into a reservoir when power is cheap and abundant, when we have overgeneration essentially, and then you let it run back downhill through a generator when demand is high and power is expensive, and you regenerate the power you used to pump it up the hill in the first place, and you put that back onto the grid. So it's essentially a big gravity powered water battery. Why is this why is this better than 90% of the storage in the world? Well, because these are huge systems. If you imagine taking a mountaintop, scooping out a reservoir at the top, filling that up with water, having a lake at the bottom of the mountain and pumping that water up and down, that's essentially what we're talking about. These are many, many times larger than something like a battery. So aside from pumped hydro, we have several other kinds of energy storage. The most prevalent, other than pumped hydro, is electrochemical, and the most prevalent of that category is lithium-ion batteries, which are about better than 80% of the market at this point globally. We also have things like lead-acid batteries, but for stationary storage, for the purpose of grid support and resilience behind the meter and other types of ancillary services like frequency regulation, you really are looking at lithium-ion right now. I should just make one other point here, which is that although pumped hydro is the most prevalent type of storage, it's not being cited very much at this point in this country. We're not building a lot of new pumped hydro, and that's just because it's extremely expensive. It takes a long time to build, and siting is very difficult. As you can imagine, there's a lot of environmental impacts from something of that size. And so it's hard to build new pumped hydro. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about batteries. If you look at the different kinds of storage that we've just discussed, on this chart, the vertical axis is power, and the horizontal axis is duration of discharge. How long can we run this thing before it gets depleted and we have to recharge it? All the way over on the upper right, we have, again, pumped hydro and compressed air, big systems that are very powerful and very long duration. Over on the lower left side, we have very fast, short duration systems like capacitors and flywheels. And these are great technologies, but they're really best for very, very brief bursts of power. And this big space in the middle is battery storage. And the reason that it's so popular right now and growing is so fast is that it is able to meet a lot of different applications and provide a lot of different services. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are those services? So there's a lot of different things batteries can do. And a lot of these things can be done whether the battery is behind the meter or in front of the meter. And I'll talk again about that in a minute. But some of these services, decarbonization, in other words, enabling electrification, enabling increased renewable generation, replacing fossil fuel generation, integration of renewables, Grid modernization, that's a very broad category, but it involves things like enabling two-way flows of power, improving resilience, decentralizing the grid, et cetera, making the grid smarter. Cost savings. If we reduce reliance on high-cost peak power generators and instead substitute, for example, distributed solar and storage, we can reduce costs for ratepayers. We can use storage as well behind the meter for things like demand charge management, which can save a lot of money for commercial customers. We can do things like investment deferral on the grid, where instead of building a new substation or expanding a substation or building new power lines, we could perhaps put in a battery to better control and regulate the amount of power that's flowing through that area, and that can produce cost savings. And equity. This is very important, especially when you talk about distributed solar and storage, that is small systems behind meters in communities. This can really help to democratize the electrical system. It delivers cost savings and resilience at the point of power consumption, at the consumer end of the system. And it can really help underserved communities to save money and become more resilient. These are the communities that are hit hardest by power outages. And so it's very important not to leave those communities behind when we're talking about energy storage. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to just briefly talk about applications and value stacking. As I said, lots of applications for storage. This is the kind of bullseye looking chart on the left. And you'll see it's divided into three sections here. There are services at the regional level, ISO and RTO services, services at the utility level, and then services at the customer level. The point of this chart is that you can site batteries at all three of these levels on the grid, but the batteries that are sited behind the meter can provide more services than the batteries sited in front of the meter. And there are various reasons. I won't go into those unless somebody asks a question later about that. But in general, distributed resources are capable of delivering more behind the meter services than centralized resources. And the distributed resources can also provide those centralized grid services if you structure the regulations to allow that to happen. Value stacking is therefore very important because when you install a battery, and they're still relatively expensive, although the costs have come down, you have to make sure that you're going to get services that are at least as valuable, hopefully more valuable than the money that you're putting in to purchase the thing. So battery owners typically engage in something called value stacking, and that simply means that you sort of stack up all the different cost savings and revenues you expect to be able to get from the battery, and you look and you see if that revenue stack is taller than the stack of costs that you're going to have to put into the battery. And the problem is that a lot of the values or the benefits that these batteries can provide are not easily monetizable in markets as they stand today. So you might have a battery that could provide, I don't know, a reduction in pollution, for example, but there's no way to maybe get paid for that. Even though you can provide that service. Or you might have a battery that provides resilience to a community resource, such as a public shelter, emergency shelter. But again, how do you get paid for that? So until those markets develop, states typically provide some kind of support like incentives to help the industry get going and the markets to come up to catch up with the technology. Next slide, please. Okay, policy. So there's a lot of different policy tools that states use. And if you look at the map, most of the states in the country at this point have used 3 or more types of policies for energy storage. And these range from short-term things such as grant programs, which are typically a sort of one-off, or demonstration projects, which can be very important, but again, are usually a one-off, to longer term policy and programs that help to build markets. And these include things like utility procurement targets and mandates, rebates, putting a storage adder into a renewable incentive program, and including storage and energy efficiency programs. Next slide, please. I will hit on a few of the highlights, but I do want to mention that Sandia National Laboratories has identified 11 policy types. Actually, I think they just made it 12, that states typically use to support energy storage deployment and market development. We're working with them on a report right now. And one of the things that we did was to survey the top decarbonization states in the country to see which of these policy types around energy storage they are in fact using to support their decarbonization goals. Next slide, please. So here is the result. I mean, this is a very high level result. We'll have a report coming out with Sandia that will go into this in much more detail. But these 5 policy issues are the ones that are most frequently used by the leading decarbonization states right now. Procurement mandates, targets, or goals, utility ownership of energy storage, incentives and tax credits for energy storage, benefit cost analysis. And this is one I haven't really spoken to, but essentially it means that you engage in a process of analyzing energy storage, either writ large or in a state program or policy or regulatory scheme. And the point of that is to make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs. And once you do that, you can then go ahead and start putting ratepayer or taxpayer money toward these technologies because you've shown that the benefits are going to be well worth it. And the 5th one is distribution system modeling. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, I want to hit a few of these at a very high level and give you an example. Here's an example of utility mandates. California was the first to come out with a storage procurement target for its utilities in 2013. That was quite early. It was a large target. Lots of other states have now done this, more than I've listed here. And one of the points I want to make here is that just because utilities are procuring storage doesn't mean utilities are owning storage. That depends on whether utilities are allowed to own storage. And that goes state by state. In this case, the California requirement is for the utilities to not only procure storage, but to procure it in different buckets. So there's transmission, there's distribution, and there's customer-sited storage. And they had to meet targets, individual targets in all 3 of those categories. And that's important because otherwise you might end up with a whole bunch of energy storage on the transmission grid, but nothing down at the distribution level and not much behind meters. What you want is to have storage placed in different parts of the grid, behind meters, in front of meters, bulk storage, distribution scale storage, so that you can, again, provide as many benefits and meet as many applications as possible. Next slide, please. So another of the popular strategies here for states is rebates. States really understand how to do rebates. We've been doing rebates for things like solar for years. So storage rebates are kind of a natural way to go for a lot of states. California, again, is a good example. They have the SGIP program, Self-Generation Incentive Program. This is massively funded. It relies on an upfront rebate with a declining block structure. We can go more into these details later if you want. But again, it's important to note that they have carve-outs for environmentally disadvantaged and low-income communities and affordable housing and for residential customers. And they've also targeted wildfire areas. So again, it doesn't have to be sort of one size fits all. You can really tailor these things depending on what the state wishes to achieve. Next slide, please. Pros and cons of rebates. There are many. I won't go through this because I'm running out of time, but we can speak to it later. Next slide, please. Storage added to existing renewables incentive programs. This is one we've seen in Massachusetts. They're not the only one, but they're the best example right now. They have something called the SMART program. and that is their solar rebate. It replaced an SREC program. And what they did essentially was that they added a storage adder to that solar rebate. And it's just one of a bunch of different adders. So if you look at the list here, if you were to do a solar installation and you used, say, canopy solar over a parking lot, and it was also at a low-income property and it included energy storage, you could stack 3 of these adders, meaning you could get the base rebate plus 3 adders. And this has been quite successful. The other thing they did in this program was that if your solar system is over, I think it's 500 kilowatts, it's half a megawatt. If it's bigger than that, you are required then to, and this is a utility scale system we're talking about, you're required to include storage. And so this has resulted in quite a few systems. Next slide, please. I think I've run out of time. So can I take another couple of minutes, or do I need to wrap this up?
Sure, you can have a minute or two. Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So I wanted to also speak to storage as energy efficiency and demand response. And this is another thing that Massachusetts has done, and it's been picked up by a number of states in the Northeast, and now it's starting to get picked up in the Mid-Atlantic states. And this is, we call it Connected Solutions because that's the name of the program in Massachusetts, but it's got a lot of different names. In Connecticut, it's called Energy Storage Solutions. Essentially what it is a way to allow customers to install behind the meter batteries and then sign a multi-year contract with the utility or a third-party integrator that allows those behind the meter batteries to be dispatched on a utility signal. And the utilities can then aggregate all of these thousands of behind the meter batteries, send a signal to dispatch them all during peak demand hours. And again, those are the most expensive hours of the year for electricity. In fact, Massachusetts did a study showing that 40% of the overall cost of electricity for the year was attributable to 10% of the peak demand hours of the year. So they're highly expensive hours. And if you can reduce your demand during those hours and flatten that load curve, you can save ratepayers a lot of money. And so what this program does is it basically allows customers to become part of the energy system. You can install a battery, buy it, lease it, sign up for the program. You get a signal, you get a notification, day-ahead notification on your phone that says, do you want to opt out? If you don't opt out, your battery is dispatched when that signal is sent by the utility, when they are seeing peak demand, and that helps to put power that's stored in that battery back onto the grid and reduces the amount of fossil fuel peaker plants that they have to be dispatched to meet peak, and that saves a lot of money. Next slide, please. And that program is in Massachusetts. It's actually done within the energy efficiency plan. In other states, it's sometimes done other ways, but it's a very similar program in all the states that have adopted it. I'm going to probably skip over cost benefit analysis for now, but I just want to note there are 2 kinds of benefits storage can provide: monetizable and non-monetizable. It's important when you do a cost benefit analysis to make sure that you are accounting for all the benefits, not just the easily monetizable ones, because if you leave some of those benefits off of the balance scale, then the benefits won't outweigh the costs. Value doesn't equal price, in other words. So we have to account for value when we're doing these kinds of analyses, even though there may not be price signals. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to skip right on. This is, I think, the last one, lessons learned. We have a report came out, I think it was last year, energy storage best practices from New England, where we gather a bunch of these best practices and explain them. So you're welcome to download that from our website. But here's a list. I won't go through it. but I just wanted to say that, again, a lot of this has to do with identifying benefits of storage that may not be monetizable in existing markets and figuring out ways to compensate storage for those benefits. That's the way you build a market. That's the way you entice industry to come in and start installing energy storage in the state. If you don't do that, what happens is that most of the benefits storage can provide aren't actually compensated, and nobody can do business that way. So you end up with just the sort of wealthy early adopters installing storage. The other thing I want to note here is that when you design a program at the state level, an incentive program or a regulatory program, you need to make sure that you find a way to link the operations of batteries with state policy goals. And you do that by sending price signals again. Otherwise, people operate batteries in ways you might not have expected. So I will stop talking now. Thanks very much. I'll turn this over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Todd. Our next speaker is Sarah Duffy, who will be discussing federal support around energy storage. Sarah?
Thanks, Megha, and thank you, Todd, for that excellent introduction to the current state of energy storage in the US. Before I get into the content that's on this slide, I actually just want to kind of set a little bit of context for where the federal government comes into all of this. Todd highlighted some key examples of state policies that are helping to accelerate the energy storage market and development. In the US, most of state regulatory power, energy regulatory power falls to the states. And so where the federal government is concerned, a lot of the levers that the federal government, both Congress and the agencies have around spurring change in the energy sector relates to financial mechanisms and mechanisms for kind of easing the burden around processes related to energy development. So you'll notice in the two pieces of legislation that I'm going to talk about, most of the action is actually kind of indirect. It's not regulating the industry or the sector, but rather trying to facilitate the transition that Todd was talking about. So back in 2021, which feels like kind of a long time ago now, the Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This was a massive investment in all types of infrastructure, including our energy infrastructure. So about 62 billion of that went specifically to the Department of Energy and was designed to spur investments in clean energy, in manufacturing of clean energy products, and in developing the skilled workforce needed for the clean energy economy. So I wanted to highlight the pieces of that 62 billion that were specifically allocated for not just energy storage, but also ancillary things that will help spur additional energy storage investment. So direct investments included 7 billion in the battery supply chain development. So this included everything from developing production of critical minerals to the end of life cycle, like battery recycling, which is definitely something that we're seeing come up more as more electric vehicles and energy storage units near their end of life. This also included over 500 million for research into long duration energy storage. As some of you might know, one of the constraints on current energy storage technologies from a battery perspective is that they don't last very long. They can hold a charge that will then provide output for a certain amount of time, but we're looking for ways to store energy over longer periods of time. Right now, the best technology for that is that pumped hydro storage that Todd was talking about. So Department of Energy is trying to spur innovation both in the development of these critical minerals and critical technologies, also looking at new technologies that might help alleviate some of these limitations we're currently seeing. Similarly, this bill included an $8 billion grant for what are called clean hydrogen hubs. This is related to the long duration problem that I just mentioned. Clean hydrogen, we have a separate power hour that I gave back in the fall on green hydrogen. So if you're curious more about the technology of clean hydrogen, I'd encourage you to check to watch that. It's on our website where all of our other previous power hours are housed. But the gist is that clean hydrogen can be a zero emission fuel type when produced correctly. And it also can be stored for long periods of time. So that is the relation to storage, because even though it has a bunch of other applications that are not storage related, it's also a very, has a lot of potential as a long duration form of storage. Another piece that could be really important for energy storage is the 11 billion in grants for local governments for enhancing the resilience of the electric grid. As Todd mentioned, battery storage has a huge value when it comes to resilience in periods of outages or during natural disasters, for providing backup energy. Now, this set of grants is not specifically only for energy storage, but because energy storage can play such a key role in resilience of the grid, we expect that that money will help accelerate the investment in storage and the development of different models of using storage for that purpose. Another piece is the expansion of this smart grid investment matching grant program. Again, that is related to increasing the flexibility of the grid. So they're slightly similar in that having a more flexible grid will increase your resilience, but resilience is more focused on being able to pun intended, weather, extreme weather events and other disasters or kind of short-term disruptions, whereas flexibility is going to be more targeted at having flexibility to respond to things like having variable resources powering the grid like wind and solar, or being able to respond to spikes in demand from various purposes. So again, while that program is not specifically designated an energy storage program, the applications will likely include various forms of energy storage and could therefore support the expansion of storage across our grid. And then finally, there is 500 million for just the existing state energy program. This has already been providing grants to local governments for clean energy programs and projects, and energy storage would qualify for those projects. Next slide. So the second piece of legislation was the Inflation Reduction Act. This passed just this past summer. There wasn't as much in this act for energy storage, actually. Most of the clean energy incentives were in the form of tax credits. So it essentially included battery storage as an eligible technology to get the residential tax credit for homeowners investing in clean energy at their house. It also extended the investment tax credit and allowed energy storage to qualify for that. And then again, similar to what I was talking about before about, investing in kind of these indirect ways, the clean vehicle tax credit will also hopefully expand or help accelerate the economies of scale for the battery supply chain, because all of those vehicles will be using lithium-ion batteries. So that's kind of a broad overview. I just had those 2 slides, so I think Anthony might be going next.
Yes, Anthony will be providing an overview on energy storage, what that looks like in Illinois high level.
Great, thank you, Mega. If we can advance to the next slide. So I'm going to go quickly through just a couple slides that are going to connect so the high level discussions that Todd and Sarah have just had about what's happening nationally and thinking about things, to the very exciting work that's happening in Illinois through the Illinois Commerce Commission. So in terms of where Illinois is today, we do have quite a few utility scale battery projects existing in Illinois. These mostly came online between 2013 to 2018. These are largely participating in what are called frequency regulation service markets. These are sort of not doing huge amounts of transferring of energy around, but small amounts that are really needed to sort of ensure grid efficiency and operations. And so there's a variety of projects, mostly batteries, but there's at least one large flywheel and then a number of large ice storage projects. If you've ever been in the Chicago Loop at certain times, you'll see large amounts of steam coming out of buildings that are actually giant ice making machines that provide cold water. And again, it's one that, to help provide air conditioning load. And it's a way to use off-peak power to help cool buildings downtown. There will be a lot more coming through various things coming from the Climate Equitable Jobs Act, and Michael will be getting into those in a little bit in terms of some of the grants for storage projects. So there's more storage coming on the way in Illinois. In terms of what we've seen at this sort of more small scale level, we have not seen a lot to date yet. Looking through our information, we only have about 250 projects in the adjustable block program, which is our program to incent small scale solar. That's only about 2 megawatts that have batteries installed with them, but that's growing over time. And I think as we see more projects get energized and review all the data for that, I expect that if we were to have the same conversation 6 months or a year from now, that number would be significantly higher. So we have a range of battery things taking place in Illinois right now. Next slide, please. In terms of one of the things that we have acquired in the adjustable block program that's been very important is to ensure that when there is battery storage for a distributed generation solar project, that the battery storage is not generating renewable energy credits, so that the power can be stored, but we want to make sure that we're measuring power only once. So we have a variety of rules in place in the adjustable block program to ensure that that battery storage is used for storage purposes and not for any way of taking power off the grid and somehow treating that as renewable energy. These are some guidelines out of the program manual for the adjustable block program. Next slide. The challenge we have, and I think this gets to some of the issues Todd was describing in terms of thinking about about good state policy and the right state policies, is that the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard is based upon renewable energy credits, and a renewable energy credit represents 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy generated. And they are viewed at the monthly level. It's a cumulative amount of energy generated by a renewable resource over that month. So there's a disconnect right now between the renewable energy credit model and thinking about storage and how to incent storage, where time is essential, thinking about when the power is being generated, how it's being stored, and when it's being dispatched. MRETS, which is one of the 2 tracking systems that is available for projects in Illinois in the MISO or Ameren part of Illinois and a lot of the co-op areas, is testing the idea of creating renewable energy credits that are more granular than monthly basis. So I think there's a lot of innovation going on that may allow us to think about RECs differently in the future, but ultimately to connect the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard to the value that can come from solar will require statutory updates to have the right sort of measurement and incentive processes available. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael, who will be describing some of the work the ICC has been doing on this and things that will point towards future policy options for Illinois.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Next slide, please. Great. Thank you, Mega. Hello, everyone. Like Mega said, my name is Michael Steer, and I'm a policy analyst in the Public Utilities Bureau at Illinois Commerce Commission. The purpose of my presentation today is just to give a brief overview of the energy storage program and workshop and webinar series that were conducted by the ICC along with the help of Sandia National Labs and the U.S. Department of Energy. I will briefly touch on some of the key findings from the proceeding, and finally I'll discuss the energy storage report that was filed afterwards, along with some recommendations that the ICC had. Next slide, please. So brief way of background, like many things, topics before us, the energy storage report had its origins through CEJA. So with the enactment of CEJA, it directed ICC to initiate basically to study energy storage in Illinois and examine specific programs and mechanisms and policies that could help support the deployment of these systems in Illinois. CEJA also provided a number of requirements for ICC to carry out such a proceeding, and three main objectives being develop a framework to identify and measure potential costs and benefits of energy storage, as well as the barriers to realizing such benefits. The proceedings were also required to analyze and estimate the impact on storage's ability to integrate renewables, the benefits of storage at specific locations, its impact on grid reliability and power control, and effect on rates. Finally, the ICC was to issue a report and any recommendations for additional actions based on its findings, including a recommendation whether we should set a energy storage deployment target for the state. So with that as a backdrop, the ICC enlisted the help of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Energy Storage Program and Sandia National Labs, and held a series of 6 webinars. Each webinar focused on a different set of topics. As you can see, each of these webinars are around 2 hours in length, and they hosted presentations from energy storage experts from national labs, regional regulatory agencies, and other energy organizations. The amount of information provided during these webinars was truly immense, and there's really no way to go through everything, 12 hours of presentations during my talk today. But these webinars really laid the groundwork and served as the foundation for the ICC's report and finding. There is a link on this site that will take you to the presentations and all materials regarding the webinars. Next slide, please. And in addition to the 6 webinar series, the ICC also hosted 4 separate workshops as well. And as you can see, the topics covered during the workshop mirrored the directives and parameters set under CEJA. This workshop process differed from the webinar series in that it provided a forum for stakeholders and participants to offer comments and opinions and insights on different program and mechanisms and policies that could be deployed in Illinois. In all, there's more than 50 sets of comments that were received from stakeholders. And like the webinar series, each of these workshops are around 2 hours in length. So adding all these workshops together brings the total roughly 20 hours worth of presentations and discussions that took part of the energy storage program over a 3 or 4 month period. And again, all of these are available on this link on the slide in case anyone's free this weekend to make their way through the 20 hours worth of presentations. Next slide, please. I'll briefly go over this, but I've already touched a few topics here, and I will touch on a few later on as well. But this is just to illustrate the framework of parameters that was set for the ICC to carry out its program. Next slide. So during the webinar series, it became apparent that while policies and programs around energy storage tend greatly or vary greatly state by state, given various policy goals, regulatory makeup, grid needs, there remains a few key concepts that states are considering. And during the webinar process, India National Labs identified and highlighted these recurring policies. Luckily, Todd mentioned and touched on a few of these earlier, so I won't have to cover these now. But again, all this is available on our website and in our storage report. So next slide. You can, next slide. Next slide. And one more. Perfect. Next, the ICC took an assessment and examined energy storage programs that were already expressly authorized under law and through CEJA. As you can see, there's three large ones, the two coal to solar programs and the utility scale pilot program for Ameren. Just to briefly touch on the grant program, under this program, CEJA provided grants to for the installation of energy storage facilities at three either current or former coal sites in the MISO area and two sites in the PJM, each of which had to have a storage capacity of at least 37 megawatts. And in total, department is authorized to spend up to $280 million over the life of the program for these projects, which will develop approximately 255 megawatts of utility scale solar. So needless to say, it's a major investment by the state to support large scale storage. Also, to briefly touch on the Ameren projects, these are two utility scale solar projects that Ameren is also allowed to host storage facilities in conjunction with their projects. I would note this just because the ICC believes it's going to be valuable that as these programs progress, just to assess how they're being used, what services they're providing, the cost savings or revenues that they're securing, and just obstacles and challenges with their deployment. Next slide. And so after the webinar series and after receiving comments from the stakeholders, the ICC issued its report on May 25th. The energy storage report will include a summary of all the information provided during the proceedings and had three main recommendations on: one, whether it should recommend specific energy storage targets for the state; two, how the ICC could continue to explore energy storage under its existing authority; and then three, it highlighted some potentially new pilot programs that would allow Illinois to gain greater experience with these systems. And given the time, I know we're pushing into the Q&A. I'll try to move quickly through this as quickly as possible. But again, just want to note that all of these recommendations are discussed at length in the ICC storage report that is available on our website. Next slide. So recommendation number one regarding energy storage targets. So while the commission acknowledged that there's substantial and useful information provided to the commission just stated that it did not appear that setting specific energy storage targets was realistic at this time. It listed a few factors: still relative nascence of the storage technology, the lack of direct operational experience, and the lack of detailed cost-benefit analysis resulting from actual Illinois storage deployment and operation. And the report stated that potentially establishing targets under such condition risks the possible over deployment, the risk of deployments that are not cost beneficial, which could lead to potentially increased costs to ratepayers, introducing biases to technology selection, and just generally adverse impacts. Next slide. So despite these risks, the report also mentioned that the webinar process and workshop process did provide sufficient information to conclude that there are measurable net benefits to be realized from the prudent deployment and operation of energy storage systems. And additionally, it is likely that energy storage systems will be necessary for the integration of renewable resources needed to meet the state's 100% clean energy goals. The ICC also noted that possibly leveraging its existing authority under other programs could provide an opportunity to help reduce barriers to obtaining the benefits of these systems, as I will discuss further. Next slide. So to briefly summarize the way that ICC could use its existing authority to design policies and mechanisms and reduce barriers, again, which is highlighted in the report, kind of surround the upcoming proceedings around, one, the distributed energy resource rebates, and two, its multi-year grid plans. So as you can see, there's a couple different rebates that were included in CEJA. One is directed to ICC to create an investigation into a new distributed energy resource rebate, which includes energy storage. Two, it extended the existing rebate for DG to include storage systems, and also included an additional rebate for storage plus solar paired with charging projects. So in summary, through investigation with the rebates, it will allow greater insight to the costs and benefits of these systems. Next slide. Multi-year grid plans. So another avenue in which the ICC could leverage its existing authority would be through the multi-year integrated grid planning process, specifically through flexibility programs and non-wire alternative and third-party services. So programs that Todd kind of referenced earlier, as far as being able to use all of the various benefits of energy storage. These multi-year grid plans are still ongoing, but the goal of them was to help accelerate and coordinate the state's clean energy goals through CEJA, and also kind of merge those goals with the utilities distribution system planning over a 5-year planning horizon. And one major objective of these plans is to prioritize the access and deployment of distributed energy resources. This includes designing these plans to meet peak reduction and load flexibility requirements, and developing peak reduction and distribution system flexibility programs and these multi-year plans are intended to meet the complementary objectives as identified in the energy storage report. So next slide. And as I mentioned with the multi-year plans, it also requires to include the identification of potential cost-effective solutions from non-traditional and third-party investments that can meet grid needs. Todd earlier mentioned value stacking. So value stacking in energy storage systems, which ties into the issue of non-wire alternatives. Just given the fact that energy storage systems can be deployed in a number of different ways. So just incorporating, using these multi-year grid plans and designing them in a way that would promote energy storage would give ICC necessary time to fully investigate the cost benefits of these systems. Next slide. And the third and final recommendation was included several new potential pilot programs. I won't go through them all because there was a number of them. And again, they are all in the storage report, but it was noted by several participants that these sort of pilot programs would allow Illinois to just gain greater experience in general with the deployment and operation of energy storage systems, and to learn from different storage policies and programs. So we can go ahead and just skip through. Next. Again, these are all in the storage energy report discussed in detail. And I'll just finish on the last slide. Next slide, please. I'll just finish there. So in closing, the work done in the energy storage program has provided a great foundation and a wealth of information for developing a framework for energy storage in Illinois. And obviously, as state policy changes and adapts, the technologies that are going to be required to support these changes will also have to adapt. And it's a belief that energy storage will play a major part in getting Illinois to its desired clean energy goals. So these are some links to the national labs that helped ICC host the energy storage program. There's a wealth of knowledge on each of these sites, including the Pacific, just to note the Pacific Northwest National Lab. It's an interactive policy database that allows you to click through and see what other states are doing. There's also 3 links to the ICC pages, One is the CGIS implementation plan, the storage, energy storage report, and also the multi-year grid plans that I mentioned. So with that, with a minute left, I will pass it back to Mega. But thank you again for having me, everyone. I was honored to participate.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks, everyone. And I know Todd has already started answering some of the questions, so I don't want to go over those questions, but I do want to maybe, little time that we have, the two questions that we actually got. One, this question is asking about, it would be great to get panelists' thoughts on how policies and incentives apply to thermal storage versus battery. There are some compelling arguments for direct thermal storage as we electrify, including more efficient and most cost-effective in many cases. It's not clear if or how incentives might apply to this category of technologies.
So in terms of federal incentives, I'm not sure that those technologies are or are not included in the grants that I discussed. I would have to look at the specific language. As far as I know, those are technology neutral, but it might that might not be the case. So in terms of federal incentives, I'd have to just point you to the text of the legislation.
Great, thanks. Another question.
as far
Sorry,
as-
go ahead, Todd.
As far as state incentives, there are usually technology neutral. And what usually happens is that you just simply define energy storage and then go with whatever is eligible under that definition. However, there have been some exceptions. For example, I think California said that large-scale pumped hydro was not eligible to be included to meet its procurement mandate. They really wanted to get new technologies and distributed technologies out into the marketplace and not have the entire mandate sort of gobbled up by one or two big, pumped hydro projects. So there you can play with definitions as you like. Thermal storage is generally included, but you should also note that it's not the same as something like battery storage. You can reduce load. You can't necessarily export power back onto the grid as a result. So it's going to provide certain types of services and not others.
Great, thanks. Just two more questions. Is a wind project added to a long duration energy storage project like compressed air energy storage excluded from the Illinois incentive? Is a standalone incentive for storage being considered? Would that be a question for maybe Anthony or Michael?
Well, it isn't clear to me from the question. Maybe the questioner could clarify what incentive they're referring to, because I mean, right now the key incentives we have are the RPS and rec purchases. I mean, as Michael was describing, there's a bunch of policy ideas under consideration, but not yet in place.
I think this question was from Joe Spees. I'm not seeing him on the chat, but we can definitely get back to him on that question to get some clarification. One more question, and because of the time, we're going to post this presentation slides. We have contact information of our presenters, so please feel free to reach out to them. But we'll take one more question. Is charging by solar required for storage DG rebate? I did not think so for certain types of projects. So maybe a clarification on that.
Whose rebate are we talking about?
Distributed generation rebate. This is from Hannah. Can you tell me who asked this question so that we can unmute the participant?
Joe Macklin.
Okay. All right, I am unmuting him right now. Joe, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is in relation to Illinois DG rebate. I didn't believe that. So there's a $250 per kWh rebate and $300 for residential. I think for net metering purposes, you need to have it charged by solar. But if you don't want to value the net metering your project, you don't need to have it charged by solar. So that was what my question was in relation to. So I just wanted to confirm that because one of the slides I thought showed something different.
That rebate is administered by each of the utilities. So I think you would have to check their specific guidelines. Which slide did that not square with?
Let's see.
I think that was mine, Joe. And I can, if you reach out to Mega, I could connect with you offline and maybe get you a better answer to your question.
Okay, you said this is Mega?
Yes, and the information is also in the PowerPoint presentation, but if you could maybe send me an email, my contact information is on the IPA website. I can definitely put you in touch with Michael.
Okay.
Thank you.
That sounds great.
So I really want to thank everyone at this point for attending our presentation on energy storage. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for providing such great insights into energy storage and what that looks like federally and in Illinois. So with that, we would like to conclude the presentation today. We hope to see you at our next Power Hour webinar on November 18th. Thank you.